This lecture will explain what REST is and how it applies to web APIs. Let me go over what the lecture covers. I'll talk about how REST is what's called a design pattern. I'll talk about how data is organized into something called resources. I'll explain what is meant by calling REST stateless. Then I'll go into detail about how REST uses the HTTP protocol and talk about what data formats REST uses. Finally, I'll compare REST to something called SOAP. If you don't understand any of this, don't panic. This lecture assumes that you don't know anything about any of these terms. As I mentioned before, REST stands for Representational State Transfer. Basically, REST refers to a style of web API. It has various features that I'll talk about in this lecture. It's a design pattern, not a protocol. Let me explain what the difference is and why it's an important distinction. Protocols and design patterns are both patterns, but a protocol has to match exactly. Let me give you an example. Let's say that you were designing something that plugged into a USB port on a computer. To make it work, you would have to have the dimensions of the plug be exact, as well as the number of pins inside, and which pin is the power pin, and so on. That's because USB is a protocol, and you have to follow it if your device is going to work. However, a design pattern is more like a set of guidelines. For example, if you were designing a house, you could make it a colonial house or an Adobe house or a Craftsman. Each of these house types has certain things that you would expect, but exactly how they're done is more up to you. REST is a design pattern. There are guidelines to follow, but they are not strict. Some APIs will follow the REST guidelines more closely than others. Because it's a design pattern, many people call APIs that follow the pattern as RESTful. RESTful API is a more accurate term than REST API, but the truth is I tend to use both interchangeably. REST is not the first type of web API. Others came before it, but they often required much more information to be passed back and forth. REST was proposed by a guy named Roy Fielding, so you might hear that name, and it provided a simpler and more flexible web API than anyone had ever seen before. REST in its pure form, the way Fielding envisioned it, is extremely flexible, but in my opinion, it's not that easy to use. Most RESTful APIs do not follow Fielding's guidelines exactly, making things less flexible, but easier to use. As I've mentioned before, web APIs have requests and responses. REST uses the concept of representational state transfer, where requests and responses can transfer the state of data that represents something. Like all web APIs, REST uses HTTP, which stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol. This is the same protocol that web browsers use. In fact, you might have noticed that when you put an address into a browser, HTTP or HTTPS will show up in the address bar. RESTful APIs send data to a Uniform Resource Locator, or URL, which is exactly the same thing as when you go to an address in a web browser. Also, HTTP has certain verbs that it can use, like get, post, and delete. I'll talk more about this in a later lecture. Finally, just like websites, APIs can use a secure version of HTTP called HTTPS. One of the most important concepts in REST is the resource. A resource is a piece of data that represents something. In REST, the name of the resource that you are working with is specified in the URL. So for example, if you're making a request about users, then your URL will have user somewhere in it. Let's say you wanted to make a call to return all users. The URL might look something like this. But if you wanted information on just one user, you can specify it by specifying the user's ID. Again, you put the information in the URL, like this. There's a later lecture about all of this that explains about resources and URLs in detail. One of the cool things about REST is that it is completely independent of format. The data that you send and get returned can be any format at all. The most popular format for REST is JSON, but XML is also very common. Sometimes the data transferred is a media format, like an image, video, sound file, and so on. Another important thing about REST is that it is stateless. Now at first this might seem confusing. I mean, the word state is part of what REST stands for, representational state transfer. But in this case, stateless means that the state of the device is not stored on a server. Let me show you an example. So this is a web page from Udemy. It's basically a list of the students who are taking one of my Udemy courses. And the first thing you might notice is that a surprising number of people sign up and don't ever even get started on the course. But that's not what I want to show you. What I want to show you is this Load More button. Basically, the web page shows me the most recent 12 students. And if I click on Load More, it loads 12 more. So what does that Load More button do? Well, it sends a message to the server, and what it could be sending is something that just says load more. Then it's up to the server to know that I've already seen 12. Send me the next 12, numbers 13 through 24. And then if I click on load more again, it's got to know now I have 24. Send me the next 12. It's going to get me 25 through 36. So that is not a stateless system, right? The server is keeping track of every single session, and it knows how many students have been loaded. And when it gets to load more, it knows which ones to send. So a stateless system, which is what would happen if this button uses REST, and maybe it does, basically when I click load more, it's up to the browser to keep track of how many times I've clicked it, and to ask the server, give me students 13 through 24 this time. So this way, the browser has to do all the math and keep track of things. And the beauty of it is, of course, that the server doesn't need to keep track of, potentially thousands of these different devices contacting it. It just knows, give me the number that the client is asking for. So it's the client that keeps track. So that's what's meant by a stateless system. And REST, as I said, is expected to be stateless. Before there was REST, the most popular way to send data over the web was something called SOAP, which stands for Simple Object Access Protocol. The problem with it was that it didn't end up being all that simple. It also supports only XML and not other formats. Unlike REST, it is a protocol, so the design had to follow strict standards. This has some advantages and some disadvantages. Let me review what this lecture covered. REST is a type of web API. It's a design pattern, not a protocol. It has requests and responses. Resources are defined in the URL. It uses HTTP to send messages. It can use any data format. It does not keep track of the device's state. Now, this has all been very abstract. Over the next few lectures, I'll go into more concrete detail so you'll have a better sense of what you'll be learning to document.